Hello and welcome back to Follow the Rabbit. Today is Friday and we are recording after a very long week with a lot of occurrences and things happening in the world at a pace that is hard to keep up with. And still, there are things that we want to unpack on Follow the Rabbit, where we are decoding emerging cultural behavior and new trends. And today, we're speaking with Sari, who wrote an essay that both triggered Johannes and mine curiosity because she is touching on a few things that we observe both in our behavior and something that we feel is missing in the conversation around AI. I mean, the classic kind of example for me is I open up LinkedIn and there are either people who are very, very pro AI and there are people who are very, very not pro AI.
Yeah, so it's either on the level of the invention of the wheel and fire, or it's gonna be the doom and apocalypse of us all. So
yeah,
I think there's room in between.
And there's definitely room in between. And not only we see that room, but Sari is obviously seeing that as well. And so, Sari, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a quick intro into what you wrote in your essay?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I feel like I could nerd out a bit about this stuff for hours, but I don't want to be the last thing keeping you from a good weekend. But yeah, I'm Sari. People always ask me to describe like who I am, and I think the best definition I've come up with, I borrow from Stuart Brand, who said, "I find things and I found things." So meaning like. Nice. He finds like, I feel like I'm a curator. I've always been a curator and love kind of hanging out at the edges of the internet, finding, hidden gems. And I found things because my whole like career, I've been like starting things. I've been founding, sometimes it's podcasts, it's companies, it's, projects. I just like, stirring the pot and making things. And currently I'm 100% focused on making Sublime, which is basically the tool that I always wish I had to curate my personal knowledge base. And I think that I've been on this journey for some time, and I've always loved curation for the sake of curation. I think there's the kind of like leisurely, joyful aspect of it where it just brings me joy. There's also the practical aspect of it, which is the more I curate things, the more I'm kind of like doing a favor to my future self who will need to reference these in future projects. And I think more recently, I think basically like in the last year, everyone has had this moment of reckoning of shit, AI is here. What does that mean for my work, for me? And I think the kind of immediate reaction, which is a very kind of natural human instinct, is one of like fear and cynicism. And we instantly kind of rush to justify human relevance of like, this is terrible and let's be dismissive and we don't need this. And the truth is that I think most people go through that stage, unless you're like Sam Altman or whatever, and like very much like benefiting from all of this. And I think for me, like because I've also been like and worked with innovation and startups and I've been very curious, I also know that this is not unique to AI. Like I remember like there is an account on Twitter that I absolutely love. I think it's Pessimist Archive or something like that. But basically it tracks like historical innovations and the resistance to them. So when books first launched, people were worried that, people are not going to socialize anymore because they'll be reading books. And so this pattern kind of repeats itself over and over and over. And I think for me personally, once I went past that stage of, okay, like I'm not just going to dismiss AI outright. Yes, my life and career is about curation and the human relevance of curation. But what is like the interesting angle to all of this? Why don't we break out of the trap of binary thinking of this is a dystopian sci-fi movie and really acknowledge how nuanced it is, right? Like AI is not good or bad. It just is. And how you use it is what dictates ultimately like what, it can do for you. And so I think for me, it's kind of the last year has been a gradual process from this instinct of like being dismissive and almost cynical about AI and this idea of like AI replacing kind of content marketing and like, all of this stuff. And all of that felt a little bit soulless to me. And then naturally, as I started using the tools, I've grown completely dependent on Claude in a way that actually has helped me be so much more creative. And so I think in some ways it sort of breaks the pattern, because you're almost taught to think that you should acquire the skills to then use them creatively. Whereas now it's the opposite. You just bring your creativity and the world's skills kind of can kind of morph and come to you. And so I think the essay that we connected over was very specifically about just how curation, like basically like AI is just a mirror, right? If your inputs are basic, then the output is basic. And so that means that curation is the real skill now, right? It's not just about collecting stuff, but about using that as input to train the AI to see like you do and to have more meaningful interactions with AI. And so I just think that basically like the skill of the future is about artfully curating contexts, right? And yeah, I just think that like in some ways, AI presents so many options. Like abundance is like the thing that it does. And so you need an editor to decide like what's good and what's bad. You need like what is like, I think it's forced me to also think about what is intelligence. Intelligence can't just be compute. It has to be that cultural intelligence, Igor, that I know you've written about. It's, if you like, our brains are not just like computing, they're experiencing the world like in sensorial ways. And I just think that it's a really interesting time to really kind of, like unpack these questions of what even is intelligence.
Well, you know what? We can actually just, say, this is it. We agree. Case closed. Let's move on. Who here has used Claude in a way where I'm like basically planning my day when I reach the limit so that I can do non-AI work, basically. And then I basically have a calendar where I'm like, this is AI time and this is non-AI time. No, I'm joking a little bit.
Every time I see Igor post a run on Strava, I know he ran into the Claude limit again and had to go for a run to bridge the time until he can use it.
Let me pick up basically on the stuff that I agree with, because the curation part I 100% agree. And again, I think specifically, Johannes and I have a long history with using, for example, also GPT or kind of like the API, even before there was ChatGPT, and we kind of built a tiny product with it early on. And I was basically saying even last year, I think like the hype, like I think the conversation is often centered also about, the kind of investments that go into those companies, the kind of valuations that are produced by it. And I think nobody here is in the conversation whether or not this is actually justified, in the sense that will it change everything? Well, kind of, but if the kind of valuations are right, I don't know. I don't really want to go into that conversation. But what I do know is, and I was saying that also like last year, even if the technology would stop at that point, it would already change quite a lot of behavior, quite a lot of jobs, quite a lot of things that we do. So I don't really care whether or not it will reach artificial general intelligence. I know that whatever that is, I know that whatever we have right now is already very significant, because I experience it every day. And I can say that for me, as someone who considers themselves also a generalist, I do struggle sometimes being a generalist, because sometimes you need a skill that kind of takes you deeper. I do have an opinion. I read a lot. I have a lot of experience with a lot of different clients. And sometimes connecting the dots is exactly the thing that you kind of require. And I think that's where the machine excels, right? And I think that's what you were kind of like also saying in your essay, but also that's the part of curations, like bringing the right things together that are on the surface maybe not even seemingly dissimilar thing, but finding those patterns, articulating them. I think that's where the AI is such a helpful companion.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think with AI, so much of like taste in some ways is it's very hard to train and it's very hard to describe, because it's very illegible, right? But the cool thing about AI, and going back to your point of being a generalist, is if you have an eye that is like trained, and because you are like somebody that is discerning, that has been exposed to so many interesting things culturally, you can, whether it's like you're designing a site, if you can curate, like, here are a lot of different sites that I like, and help me design one. You don't necessarily have to express what you like about them. It's just the sheer act of being able to say, like, I put my name on this one. You know, these are the things that like, that I like, that in some ways, like, all of the skills I think will collapse until all that is left is taste.
Yeah. Do you have some examples from your everyday life and work how you use Claude? Just for people who've made, I mean, there are probably going to be people who listen who've never used Claude. They might have tried out ChatGPT a bit. I'm always like, find it interesting that people seem to use it a lot to ask questions of like, what is this, what is that, and like, that's dangerous because you never know if it's right. But what do you use Claude?
Yeah, it's so funny and interesting because I use it for everything, literally. Like, I think initially I started with, I'm writing an essay and it's like, I don't like this sentence. Can you help me rewrite it? So it started off very basic as a, like, writing companion. And then I think the prompts over time have become a lot more, I think, high level, right? So sometimes it's like I found like certain prompts that I think are like yield very interesting responses. So I'll often, like for writing, for example, I'll paste something that I wrote and be like, what might people dislike about this? So it's just like it becomes like a framing conversation. So I think a lot for writing. I think a lot for untangling business challenges, right? Like, I think a lot of people don't know that, like, you can go like a level higher with Claude every time. You know what I mean? Like, there's just something about, like, if you're like, yeah, but it can't help me with this. Like, have you tried? Have you tried to go a level higher? I think so much of what I use it for these days is stuff that requires I be very patient in feeding it the right context. So some of my most favorite use cases are, I am like, I think probably similar to you, my mind is racing with like collecting and connecting ideas. So I often have a lot of things that don't feel quite legible yet, or they are not at a stage where they're linear, right? It's like, a perfect example. I have a collection on Sublime called Making Sublime. And for more than a year, I have been collecting disparate references that in some way, shape, or form remind me or inspire me or inform why we're building this product, why it needs to exist. And again, it's like I couldn't, like, unless I sat down for many, many hours, find the thread or the through line between those things. All I know is that in my mind, when I see something, oh, this resonates, it reminds me of Sublime, I feed it into this collection. Now I have this collection that when I want to like distill Sublime into a mission statement, distill Sublime into a media kit, help me create a post that explains like why this needs to exist. But it's fed off of this very brilliant context that I think is like, that is the unique thing that nobody can replicate, because if they do, it's not me anymore. Right.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of what I use it for is like, I basically, I have a lot of collections like this. Like one of them, I shared two examples in the essay, but another example is Making Sublime. I'll share more examples. So I have a collection called Phrases. And basically when I read a phrase, it could be in a book, in an article that I just love. It makes me feel something. It's just so soulful. It's so artfully constructed. I add it to this collection. And it's like such a compelling collection of like ways of expressing something that is far from generic. And usually like when I'll have an essay or something I've written or a presentation, I'll be like, okay, I need an opening sentence for this essay. Here's an example of styles that I really love. And so I'll get that context. And then, it's like tone, style, nuance based on this collection. So that's like another thing. And like that, basically like a lot of the ways in which I use Claude the best depend on me feeding it all this context. So for example, like I send a lot of emails for Sublime, and my like mantra is like, don't be boring. Make sure the emails are not boring. Make sure they feel like human and alive. And so I like feed Claude, like, hey, here's some emails that I thought were really cool from other companies, et cetera, past ones we've sent. Help me like construct. And so I just think that the curation skill is just, it's a surprise to me, because when I started this company, I never thought that curation could become so much more valuable in so many more ways with AI. And it required going from like cynicism to like extreme curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the use cases that I have, I call it kind of Venn diagramming, when I have like two things and I'm kind of curious where they overlap and how that overlap looks like. And I let it basically figure out, and it kind of provides me, with literature references or something that it basically sees as something that somebody else wrote on the overlap. And I think for me, this is never like the final answer. It's just a starting point for another form of curiosity that I can then engage. And so this kind of like bringing two things that are seemingly not connected together is something that I love. I mean, for us, so, I mean, as kind of people of the internet, I think collecting things, collecting everything that we find, and both Sublime and other tools, basically having all those kind of like resources. It used to be that the collecting felt a little bit, I mean, it was useful. I mean, we just, in a previous conversation, we talked about, the old days of Pinboard and Delicious, when all those things started.
Yeah.
And those were super useful as well for their context. But at the same time, a lot of the collection felt a little bit like, as I collected it, but how do I kind of get back to it? How do I make it useful? How do I kind of like extract the value from it? And now with AI, like you described, for example, the collection has a different meaning. It becomes a curation that you can use. And I think that's also the beauty of, LAMs and RAGs, the ability to engage in unstructured data and still see connections between it. There is no necessity of having a database that's already kind of predefined, but also excluded a lot of the context that you would usually kind of have, and have an ability to, by being curious to unstructured data, create new meaning out of it. I think that loop is something that AI really excels with, and I don't know if we had any kind of form of technology. I mean, of course there are, libraries, but it kind of like the speed and effort that you need to put in to, bring different domains together is something that's not very easy for an individual. And yet I kind of like, where I do want to not really push back on you, but more like on us as a group who is kind of agreed, and is basically, the question is, how do we get good at the curation part, right? And I think we are all have at least some experience of, living pre-AI, living pre that space where a lot of that effort was necessarily by human kind of curiosity and putting in the time, putting in the effort. And I think there is, I mean, for me at least, a justified kind of thing where I would say, well, in a scenario, Johannes and I used to do a lot of scenarios back in the day, in a scenario where Claude or ChatGPT disappear right now, say regulation, or they go out of business or whatever, like, it would be actually kind of difficult to do what I'm doing right now. Like, it would create a certain effort. So I'm kind of curious about how we create dependencies on certain technologies for us as well. I mean, that being said, obviously I would be also hard, like without electricity, I wouldn't be able to do a lot of things either.
Yeah. But I mean, I think the question of how do we get good at curation, I think is the crucial one, right? I think if you think about the skill sets that will be valuable over the next like decade now with AI, I think so much of it is going from technical skills and to like basically judgment and refinement, right? So much of it is like, you like the AI can create a first draft. How do you kind of consistently refine that? And how do you judge an abundance of choices? And so I think if you like unpack like the skill of judgment and refinement, how do you get good at that? I think that is like the crucial question. I don't necessarily have an answer to, but I think, and I'm curious to hear what you all think, but I think a couple things. I think first of all, everything on the internet is designed to help you like mindlessly scroll, right? Like our attention is basically, we have basically delegated our attention to the world's largest advertising companies. And so in the kind of structure of this feed, you're not forced to like really truly kind of reckon with what you're reading and seeing on screen. You just kind of like, one tweet about politics, one tweet about war, one tweet about somebody's cat dying, one hot take about, the latest kind of tech thing. It's so kind of unrelated and disorienting that unless you carve out the space, like it's such a compulsive experience that unless you carve out a space that is more reflective, I don't think you'll be able to be a good curator of anything. You have to basically like a gardener, weed out certain things and then take them to a space where you can more meaningfully engage with them, right? It's like I've been working with an incredible designer over the past 2 weeks to design the landing pages for Sublime. And I basically created first drafts of everything. I think with, a lot of it with the help of Claude, but I think my skill as a generalist is I consider myself somebody that has good taste. I can curate, I can get to a first draft. Then I need to work with somebody really good to kind of for the last mile. But looking at the choices, like the very, very detailed choices that they're making, like tiny things, it just requires like treating attention as sacred, right? Because it's all in the tiny details. And I just think that is it requires like good curation in some ways, like requires like resisting the algorithm and just like devoting an insane amount of time to one thing, And I just think that that's something that like has been lost. But I'm curious, how you kind of think about it. Because I related a lot to like attention and how to like engage with our attention in more safe ways.
Yeah, we do have opinions on attention.
So I have Chris Hayes' Siren's Call, How Attention Became the World's Most Endangered Resource, like right here. We talked about.
Yeah.
So just a couple of things that I find interesting or that came to mind listening to you. I find it really interesting, or I think a huge role in how we all approached AI, like specifically LLMs in the beginning, was based on what came before that in like hype cycles. So we had all the crypto and Web3 stuff. Then the whole metaverse hype came. They all felt rather shallow and like very, very money driven or grift driven. And then what felt like the same people were telling us, oh, no, it's all about AI. And this time it's real. And you're like, don't
it's
care.
like
I know
AI
exactly how that was.
Crypto influencer suddenly a couple months later is an AI influencer.
Yeah, exactly. They all did search and replaced metaverse with GPT something. And so actually it took me, I think, a couple of weeks until I tried ChatGPT because I was like, no, I'm not falling for this one again. And I think this was like in the beginning, we all didn't want it to be a thing because we didn't want to give a win to the tech bros. I think that was part of that. And then I think because the actual discourse around AI is so old and so influenced by science fiction and conversations that we all thought, okay, this is going to be about automation. So what can these tools take over from me? And so here, write the text for me. And then you see all of this like very shallow, mediocre text. You're like, oh, that's bad.
Yeah.
Create these images and they all look the same and have this certain style, and everybody forgot to count fingers and things like that. It was like, this is bullshit. But then also like these, like the models changed over time and the user experience and the product development around them changed. I think for me, I played around with ChatGPT a lot and used part of it. I think for me, it really changed with Claude. And so I heard like somebody like, oh, Claude is actually quite good. Like, I don't know. Okay, tried it out and found out it's so much better in conversations than the rest. And that for me really changed something. We're like, oh, this is not like somebody I give work to do to automate. This is much more like it helps me think. It helps me think out loud and helps me to be creative and asks me good questions. So that's what I use it a lot for. Like, I have an idea. Here's a couple of thoughts. Ask me questions to figure out more what I mean.
But I think that's connected to the attention part as well, right? Because through the fact that this is an instrument that isn't actually designed. Well, first of all, you pay for it. So that in itself already creates a somewhat different kind of experience.
Yeah.
So the extraction, I mean, I think they still kind of get a lot of out of the fact that we're using it, but that's a whole different story. But I think because it is a different experience and you're kind of like, it actually captures more of my attention and it prevents me from, engaging in all those other platforms because I get actually something done. I get something from, it's not the same thing as a human interaction, but if we're not comparing it to a human interaction, it actually in some ways is better because it can do something that I can definitely do and I can do something that it can do. And so if I think like that, the ability to, how they say, imagine harder. So what Johannes was saying, like it's people thinking that it's only about automation when in fact it is about a lot of people are talking about it in this way. It's like the Centaur model where it's about the human and the machine coming together and by being a combination out of the two, it becomes the best out of both worlds. And I think that's where also your essay is going to. This is where a lot of kind of like the arguments that we're trying to build around those kind of conversations. And I think attention, as you mentioned, plays a huge role in it because yes, obviously there's a lot of content out there now on LinkedIn and all those places where you're like, well, this is being produced by AI because the attention game needs new content, right? So there's a lot of just content for content's sake. I'm kind of always amused by those. I built this fully automated thing and it will generate you kind of leads. And I'm like, sure, you have 100,000 leads, but who's actually interested in it? I think there is that level of conversations too.
One thing I find amusing is, it seems like all three of us kind of basically came around from this kind of very dystopian, automation-driven narrative to actually there's a different kind of relationship here. AI as a creative partner is very compelling. And what I find amusing is that a lot of the leaders of these companies are not telling stories about a human future that we actually want to be part of, right? It's like, it's like you launch this general purpose technology and it's like, it could do anything, but, you release it and the story is kind of decentralized. But I feel like maybe it's because that is just my approach with building Sublime. It's like story first. It's like, what is the emotion, the kind of point of view? And then the product is really about kind of living those values. But I think a lot of these technologies are just kind of released into the wild and we are left to kind of interpret the stories behind them. And I just think technology right now is arguably like the most compelling on a philosophical level than it's ever been. It just calls into question some very interesting philosophical questions. And I don't think the leaders of these technologies, like the 5 billionaires that run all of this stuff, are doing a good enough job of telling stories about how good the future can be in a way that we all feel excited about. And so I think so much of the reason the essay I wrote, I think resonated with this audience of creatives and creators is because there is like a human-centric story around you matter. And you plus AI is like, it's a very powerful combination. And I just think we need more of those stories because at the end of the day, like what is technology is like technology for the sake of technology is whatever. It's like, it's got to be technology for the sake of humanity.
I think there's a very interesting part here. That's you mentioned like the AI lab founders like Sam Altman, Amodei, and from who's run Anthropic. And the thing here is, those people are batshit crazy, to put it very bluntly.
I would say at least Amodei is a little bit in a different league than Sam Altman.
Yeah, but also like the other people connected to that, and also the people doing all the like the DeepMind and Google Gemini stuff, they are part of a cult. And it sounds crazy saying that, but it is the way. And that's the reason why they are not about telling a very positive future about this, because they are in the race to do AGI first, because they are afraid of what's happened if others doing it and taking over. There's this whole AI accelerations. So they are not going to tell the positive story. But then the second part that I found really interesting when I listened to you both is, if I look at my LinkedIn feed, for example, I see a lot of AI influencers and so-called experts, and they are all about, like Igor said, here's the perfect prompt. And they all give you the idea, if you just know how to prompt or frame or configure these tools, then you will win at this thing. But I think the part that we both realized in using it, and then that draw us to your essay, is the point of taste and the idea that the difference in the output from these LLMs is the human who is doing not the prompting in itself, but like who has like an opinion, who's saying, here's my idea, help me express it, help me make it like better understand, help me extend it. And this is, and you can, no prompt in the world can give you better taste in that, or give you an opinion, give you an idea, give you a way to look at the world. And so this is why I think, and so we had Kai Chaika on the podcast in an earlier season, and he talks a lot about taste. And the fascinating thing is that it's always really hard. So how do you actually get good taste? And there's no like clear, like, oh, here's a tutorial, and then you will have taste and things like that.
I think this is the time to be kind of like Claude, one of my favorite books. It's Finite and Infinite Games. And I think there is this component that, what we're describing is a game that wants to be played, not to be won. While everyone else is like, the AI people are in a race to win because they do think that there is something to be gained. And I think taste is the same. You do not, like, my taste today is different from my taste 10 years ago. There are obvious patterns and overlaps, but being free with myself to let it develop, by basically experience things and integrate them into my life, and also not resist them in a way, is what makes me me. And the point of this is basically, is the longer how many years I have, the point is to kind of continue doing that. And I think that capacity of curiosity, not wanting to win necessarily in the classic sense, but wanting to continue doing this, is what differentiates it. I would just, as a final thing, let me say that I don't think we are the business model that they imagine. I don't know if we are the byproduct, or the use cases that we kind of describe are probably somewhat unintentional, which is absolutely fine by me. I'm just saying, I'm not sure if they're aiming for us.
Yeah, no, we are what Gibson said. We are what Gibson meant when he said the street finds its own use for things.
Yeah, I love the idea of infinite games. That the James Carse book is such a canon for me. And I think, Johannes, what you said about the race they're on, I've always believed that you should never attribute to malice what is just incentives, right? It's there's a reason why YouTube and Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook, they all start to look the same. It's why, they could do whatever they want, and they all launch stories. It's just, everything looks the same. And
it's called human-centric design.
Right. And personally, I care so much about the infinite game, and making Sublime a game I can play, a sandbox to play and have fun. But they're playing a different game. They're playing a game of winning. And so I do agree that a lot of the lack of intentionality in the storytelling is because now there's just a competition of who has the most powerful model, and do you have a billion parameters or not? And I think a lot of it comes down to poor incentives. But I think back to the question of how do you develop good taste? I think it's actually simple. I think it comes down to surrounding yourself with great work, which is something that none of us do for the most part, because the incentives of our entire digital economy are oriented around disposable content. It's all about the never ending now. Everything that you see today in the main platforms where we consume information is about what happened today. What about like so much of the most interesting wisdom is what stood the test of time, the kind of like ancient writing, the books that were written like decades ago. And I think most people are not exposed to that. You have to get out of your way to find that kind of great work and expose yourself to the best things humans have ever done. And if you do that and do that with a discerning eye, and obviously in my view, like you need to have tools to kind of consistently like return to and nurture and garden these things, I think like taste becomes a natural byproduct of that. But it starts with your information diet and really resisting the default attention economy.
Yeah, I mean, we do live in very polarized times in which it's increasingly clear that there are sometimes very narrow, media diets that people are consuming. And it's obviously also harder and harder for them, like for people to break out of it. And I mean, I think that's a whole own conversation in itself that also will be left for many years to come, I would assume. Connects also a little bit to taste. Like I do have my taste, whether it's good or not, it's up for debate, but I do have my taste. And my brain often doesn't quite allow me to do the kind of work that I want to be doing, like the kind of writing that I can do now because I have my editorial assistant. And I think there is also, for me at least, this ability to introduce to, kids, this ability to learn differently, because not all learning paths are the same. And schools are having a hard time to, bring in the kind of tools for all the different types of learning. There are people with disabilities or, conditions that are maybe not quasi equipped to do a lot of things. And I think for me, just judging by my own experience, I'm able to express myself now differently because I have those tools. And I think in that conversation about AI being binary and so forth, I think a lot of that is not being addressed enough because those tools are enabling people to do a lot of things that haven't been possible before.
Yeah, it's interesting that, to your point about my taste, I think so much of like the value of being able to put a ton of unstructured data into AI, have it like actually help you be like, all right, here's a lot of things I like. What distill the qualities of this? Like, what is the kind of like stylistic DNA of this? Because I think a lot of these things are very hard to articulate. And I think I actually haven't tried it, but I think that's a potentially interesting use to try to like truly like distill and express and articulate a specific like, qualities of.
That brings me to the part from a different perspective that I sometimes worry about, because I think we all kind of grew up in, to a certain extent, even like an algorithmically organized internet and feeds. And so we learned, like we just looked at a lot of things and we like this, and we put, I remember us putting like RSS feeds together and like, this is what we follow and stuff like that.
Text on Delicious. Text on Delicious was how you discover things.
There you go. So I think this is how like we created a certain taste of what we like. And this now helps us enormously, like you and your essay make very clear, to use these tools in a different way. And I'm wondering how people who basically grew up with algorithmically organized feeds, who are like scrolling all day, and then again to reference Kai Chaika, where a lot of flattening is happening. Everybody's to a certain degree seeing very similar contexts, so very focused on microtrends, not really rediscovering the classics or like or even like very weird literature from other times or stuff like that. So how do they? So I'm wondering, how do you like evolve taste or like fine tune your taste in a purely algorithmic feed-based world to actually then use these AI tools to really help you express your taste?
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful question, because I think it's very hard to do what you're describing in an algorithmic world, because at the end of the day, like, we like to believe that we are unique and we have a unique taste. But when you orient yourself and your life in algorithmic feeds, your mind becomes programmable. If you show me this aesthetic 100 times, then I'm going to like coffee shops that look exactly like this. And everything becomes completely flattened. And that's why I think that in order to, like, some of the most interesting people I've gotten to collaborate with, designers, writers, they have media diets that are far more varied and interesting than the algorithm. Like, I just think that the reality is that if all you consume is whatever TikTok's for you serves you, Twitter's for you serves you, like, your mind is being programmed by somebody else.
Yeah. And I think the
mic drop moment, I'd say.
That's the truth, really, because that's basically the connection between the fact that how people are using AI and how they imagine what AI can be used for is really ingrained in their ability to be curious and have a position before coming into the conversation or interaction with AI. That is true to all things in life, but obviously AI it's not like, it's such a powerful thing because it is not just one thing. It's not Excel. It's not PowerPoint. It can be a lot of things for a lot of different people. And the more open a technology is, the better you need to be coming into this conversation to extract the kind of value that you need, because there are certain rules that you can follow, but they're not, it's still very much open, as we have discussed today. Sari, we thank you very much for your time and this beautiful conversation. We'll be linking, obviously, as always, to Sari's essay in the link notes. Thank you all for listening. And if you have questions, drop us a line. If you think this conversation is interesting to someone else, please forward it. Also, please test Sublime. They're coming out of beta really soon, so there is a really great opportunity to jump on the bandwagon, test it, and get a better price out here.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I'll share a link with you so you can give your listeners early access if they'd like. But this has been so awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Have a good one.
Thank you.